In this tutorial, I'm going to show you 5 different ways that we can color grade our compositions. Let's check it out. Hello and welcome everybody to Blended Graphics. My name is Jason Ortega and thank you for joining me on our day 14 of our 30 days of Photoshop. And for today's episode, we're going to focus on color grading. Photoshop has so many different tools that we can utilize to color grade our works. However, I'm going to focus on 5 different techniques of what I use most often when I color grade my different compositions. And these techniques may or may not be the methods that you use for your work. My goal here is to show you just a little bit more of an insight to my process and how I approach color grading with my compositions. If you've been following me on my 30 days of Photoshop journey, and you haven't done so yet, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and click that bell to stay notified. Alright, let's not waste any more time, let's jump right into this. Alright, so here's our fun little aliens from Toy Story composition that we're going to use for today's video. And the first technique that we're going to talk about are color lookup tables. And this technique is probably the easiest, especially if you're in a bit of a creative block and you're not really sure what direction you want to go with. Alright, so let's go to the bottom of our screen here to the Adjustments Layer tab. And we're going to click on that and let's look for Color Lookup. And we'll click on that as well. And then we want to click on the drop box that says Load 3D LUT, which is Lookup Table. And here you'll see a bunch of presets that we can cycle through and just kind of experiment with. And maybe one of these will spark a bit of inspiration as to the direction that we want to go with. So like I said, this is a quick and easy way to maybe get a little bit of a spark to get us going. And if we choose one, we can always lower the opacity and then we can add another lookup table on top of this as well and just kind of continue to layer this one on top of another, and maybe we can start getting more of a feel for what we want. So let's do one more here and maybe we'll add this one, and same thing, we'll drop the opacity a little bit, and with those 2 combined lookup tables, this might be good enough for us. So that's method number 1. Tip number 2, we're going to talk about gradient maps. So let's go back to the bottom of that screen and click on that adjustments layer, and then we want to click on where it says gradient map. Alright, from here we want to click on that slider, and on this left anchor, that's typically where our dark colors should go. So let's find a nice dark tone to use for this side. And then we'll click on the right one, which should be our brightest points. And at this point, honestly, it's just about experimenting. Just kind of have fun with this, select some different colors that go well with each other, and it's really just trial and error and personal preference. It can also be very addicting too, and just, playing around with the colors and just mix and matching, and maybe something good will come up out of this. And just like the color lookup tables, the gradient map method is another really easy way for us to play around with mixing colors if we're not really sure the direction that we want. And once you have your colors in place, you can even tone down the opacity so it's not so much in your face and it's so prominent, but just kind of gives you a little bit of a hint that those colors are there. Okay, so for method number 3, we're going to talk about the color balance adjustment layer. Alright, once again, we're going to go back to our adjustment layers and we're going to click on color balance. From here, you will see all these different sliders. And in the drop box, we will also have our shadows, midtones, and highlights that we can apply these colors to. And again, this is a pretty simple way where we can just kind of move around the sliders and we can see for ourselves what works well, what doesn't work well. If maybe you have an idea that you want your piece to be more of a warmer tone, you can stick with the yellows and reds or magentas, or if you want it to be on the cooler side, you can do the opposite effect and maybe stick towards the blues and cyans or even the greens. Alright, so let's hit those double right arrows and we can check out our before and after applying this color balance adjustment layer. And we can drop the opacity just a touch as well. And I also want to note that I use color balance probably most often, but I usually use it to match my subjects to the background. So I like to get my sky looking the way I want the feel of the picture to look first. And then once I have my sky in place for the color grading, then I start going with my subjects using the color balance adjustment layer and tweaking those sliders to match the tones of my sky. Okay, let's go ahead and now move over to method number 4, which is selective color. And back in the adjustments layer, yet again, we're going to find selective color. And this tool can be extremely powerful, especially if you know your color theory really well. It can also be very destructive if you're not as familiar with the color theory. Or it can be destructive even if you do know your color theory really well. But like I said, it is a powerful tool. I typically use the selective color when I want to just maybe alter a specific tone in my piece to match a certain color. Like especially if I have two different color grasses between different images and I just want to match the tones of those so that they balance out. A lot of the times I use selective color for that. All right, so looking now in our selective color properties panel, you can see how selective color really isolates those individual tones and lets you customize that one way or another. And this is when the color theory really comes into play because we have our CMYK value sliders, and it's important to know the opposites of those colors as you start to move these anchors one way or another. So the opposite of cyan is red, opposite of magenta is green, opposite of yellow is blue, and the opposite of black is white. And so you can see here how powerful this can be when you are really customizing these individual tones and shifting them to the hue and saturation that is to your liking. But as you start moving these all over the place, it can be quite destructible as well. All right, so let's go ahead and start playing around with these anchors a little bit. Obviously, we're in our reds. So if we want to darken this or brighten this, we can move our black slider. So we'll brighten it just a little bit. Maybe give it a little bit more magenta, just a little touch. And then we can go to our yellows and play around with the sliders here. And as you can tell that the yellow is primarily going to be affecting our aliens and their skin tone. So we don't want things too crazy. All right, so maybe just a little bit more. All right, and back in our color panel here, you can see we have our highlights, midtones, and shadows. So it's very similar to the color balance layer. It gives you those properties plus more, where you can, again, customize these individual tones. All right, so we'll make our final adjustments in our whites, but this is looking pretty good. All right, so let's accept that, and we can see our before and after. And it's a subtle change, and it looks nice. And if you're okay with that, great, you're done. If you want to continue working and using some of our other methods, you can do that as well. We can also talk about our fifth and final method, which is going to be the camera raw filter. And you'll find the camera raw filter under the filter tab at the top, and then scroll down to where it says camera raw filter. But before you do that, make sure that your layer is converted to a smart object first. Okay, so here's our camera raw filter. And within the camera raw filter, we have several different tools to work with when it comes to color grading. So we have these tint and temperature sliders that we can easily alter and can be a pretty quick and easy step if you want to change the color grading a little bit. So we can play around with those. And we have more tools here, but not so relevant to color grading. So we can get out of that and we'll go into the color grading tab. Now here we can play around with the highlights, midtones, and shadows and change those colors as well. So we have our color slider here that we can find a specific tone that we're looking for. And one technique is if you hold down the Shift key, you're locked into that specific tone. And if you hold down the Control or Command key, then you're locked into that specific saturation, but can still search for other colors. You will also notice that we have three sliders at the bottom: luminance, blending, and balance. Luminance will take that tone and either brighten it or darken it within those three subcategories. The blending will say how much of that tone goes into your three subcategories. And then the third one, which is the balance, will identify where the highlights or shadows kind of begin within your midtones, highlights, or shadows. All right, so now that we've kind of wrapped up our highlights, we do have one more section, which is our global category. And this will affect your entire picture. Just kind of like at the beginning under our basics tab where we had the tint and temperature. This is very similar to that, where we can just find an individual solid color to kind of take over the entire composition. All right, and so we have one final stop within our camera raw filter. I didn't mean to do that. Let's get back in there. And we want to find the color mixer tab, which is right here. We'll click on that, and the color mixer tab is very, very similar to our selective color adjustment layer, where we can go to these individual tones. We can increase or decrease the luminance, affect the saturation and hue. And again, this tailors those individual tones, and we can manipulate that and shift them one way or another. So the camera raw filter is essentially, 1,000 different tools in one, which is why it makes it so incredibly powerful. And I typically use the color mixer as a final correction if I want to brighten a color or make it darker, or if I want to increase the saturation of an individual color. But anyways, there you have it. Those are our 5 different color grading methods. Some honorable mentions include the solid color adjustment layer, the hue and saturation adjustment layer, or even the gradient adjustment layer. So those are some other various ways that you can do some color grading changes within your composition. Thanks again for joining me for today's video. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you also want to see some more of my personal work, be sure to follow me on Instagram. It's Blended Graphics. And I hope to see you again for tomorrow's video. Take care, everyone.